Chapter 16. Destiny. Kira nervously twiddled her thumbs as she rode the elevator up to Professor Ozpin's office. She wasn't sure why, but Kira felt nervous, much like she did before her first ever tournament fight. As the elevator opened up, she spotted Professor Ozpin sitting behind his desk. On the right side of the room she saw a man she had never seen before, a disheveled man with spiky black hair and crimson red eyes. On the left was Professor Goodwich and General Ironwood. Kira caught Glinda's eyes as she entered, and the professor gave her a comforting nod and smile which Kira returned. The office itself was tinted with a dull, orange haze as the many open windows gave a majestic view of the currently occurring sunset. "Ah, Miss Nikos. Please, take a seat." The headmaster greeted with a smile as he gestured to the open chair in front of his desk. Kira gave another small smile in return and took a seat. She glanced at the stranger standing there, but he made no motion to introduce himself, instead opting to take a drink from his flask. The action somewhat disconcerted Kira, but Ozpin didn't seem to mind his presence, so she decided to ignore him. Meanwhile, Professor Goodwich and the general were content to let Ozpin do the talking. "I'm sorry to have called you up so suddenly, Miss Nikos." Ozpin began. "I hear your match in the semi-finals went well. I assume your team is sending you to the finals." Kira gave an awkward chuckle. "Well, we still need to talk about that. We weren't sure who to send, myself or John." "Sure, sending an attack dog to the finals is a real good look." Kira snarked. Turning at the interruption and rude insult at her teammate and leader, Kira stood and glared at the stranger, an action that was mirrored by Glinda. "I'm sorry, who are you?" she asked, voice devoid of its usually politeness. "The name's Kiro." He growled back. "Kiro is a trusted colleague of mine." Ozpin intervened before any incident could occur between the two of them. Kira maintained her glare on Kiro for a beat longer, before returning to the headmaster. "Professor, why did you call me here?" Still smiling, Ozpin said. "Please take a seat." And when Kira did so, he continued. "Tell me, what is your favorite fairy tale?" Kira stood nervously in the elevator as she rode it down, surrounded by Ozpin, Kiro, Glinda, and Ironwood. "Where are we going?" Kira apprehensively asked. "The vault, under the school." Ozpin responded calmly. The elevator dinged open, revealing a massive, underground tunnel lined with dim, green lights. "So these maidens," Kira began as she exited the elevator with the professors, taking in all of the sights around her. "You say I can be next in line to take their powers, but how does the power choose?" "Through a series of bullshit rules." Kiro drawled out. "Kiro." Glinda snapped, before turning to Kira. "As we understand it, when a maiden dies, whoever is in her final thoughts is the first candidate to inherit her power. Unless it's a dude or an old hag. Then it goes to someone random." Kiro chimed in once more. "Then our job gets a whole lot harder." As Kiro finished speaking, he turned back ahead as they had arrived at their destination. And that's when Kira saw her. The Fall Maiden, her beautiful dark skin burned and scarred, currently held in some sort of stasis pod connected to a large machine, with a second pod on the opposite side. "Is that?" Kira whispered out as she hesitantly stepped forward. "The current Fall Maiden. Amber." Ozpin sighed and let his head hang at his failure to protect her. Kira watched in abject horror as Amber's chest slowly rose up and down. "And she's still alive. For now," Ironwood answered. "We're using Atlas technology to keep her stable, but there's a lot about this situation that's unprecedented. Normally when she passes, the power would transfer over to the next host. But it's not uncommon for the last thoughts of the slain to be of their attacker. And to make matters worse, her power has been split. It's more than possible it will seek out her other half. Which her assailant has." Kira connected the dots. "And none of us want that." Ozpin added on. "The worst case scenario is someone who would abuse this power becoming or controlling a maiden. It's why our organization hid the maidens away, letting them fade into legend hundreds of years ago. In doing so we prevent war and panic the mere existence of the maidens would cause." "And you want me to inherit this power?" Kira murmured to herself more than anything. Such a power offered was terrifying, as was the responsibility that came with it. But regardless of how they tried to hide it, Pyrrha could tell that Ozpin and the others were desperate for her aid, her abilities. If she had the capability to do good, was it not her duty to do so? But such power, what would it do to her? Seeing her internally struggle, Ozpin felt compelled to tell her one more piece of information. Yes, but that is not all. Given Amber's condition, you cannot inherit her powers naturally. But General Ironwood believes he has a solution. We in Atlas have been studying aura from a more scientific standpoint, how it works, what it's made of, how it can be used. We've made significant strides, and we believe we've found a way to capture it. The general answered. Capture it and transfer it into something, or someone else. Pyrrha's face fell at that revelation. That's wrong. She cried out. Desperate times call for desperate measures. James countered. But there is a catch. We can't transfer Amber's power to you, but we can give you what those powers are bound to. Pyrrha's sense of dread deepened. Her aura, her life, Ozpin added on, would become intertwined with yours, fusing your soul with hers. The question is, what's that going to do to you? Kiro finished. As the gravity of the choice weighed upon her, Ozpin nodded and said, and even then, there is no guarantee the transfer will work. And if it does, there's no telling if you will be the same person after. That's when the parallels of this situation clicked in Pyrrha's head. Everything they talked about sounded similar to what was happening with John. His constantly growing abilities, his drastic change in personality. John's power made him far stronger than anyone else, but it changed him for the worse. That. Pyrrha held her tongue for a brief second, wondering if it was her place to tell them about John. She looked the faculty over, and while she did not know either Kiro or the general enough to properly read them, she could tell at least Professor Goodwitch and Ozpin were sympathetic to her plight. She also knew that John was closer to Professor Goodwitch more than any of the other faculty member. And despite all of her words, Pyrrha didn't really know how to help John other than being there for him. Resolving herself, Pyrrha spoke. That sounds ominously familiar. The teachers had a small look of surprise, but didn't interrupt as she kept speaking. John. He's been having dreams. Memories even, of another man he's never seen before. A warrior that John believes gave him his powers. And not just his power. John. He thinks the man's memories or personality may be overriding or merging with his own. Anyone could tell that John is different now. Pyrrha's mouth dried as she said the next words. He's becoming dangerous, both to himself and to others. It hurt Pyrrha's heart to speak of this, to reveal the secrets of someone so close to her without their permission. But Pyrrha said she would do what she had to make sure John got help. The teachers all glanced at each other, their faces a mixture of concern and alarm, however muted. Glinda stepped forward towards Pyrrha and said in a hushed tone, I noticed something similar, Pyrrha. While I was not aware of the dreams, John did imply something about this happening to me. That combined with his newfound abilities. Yeah, the power to shoot lightning from his fingertips and drain the life force out of Grim ain't exactly natural. Kiro grumbled out, earning another glare from Glinda. Drain Grim of their life force. Pyrrha parroted, confused. Glinda cast her a sympathetic look. He didn't tell you. She whispered more to confirm it to herself than to inform the redhead. During the breach, John displayed the ability to, as Kiro put it, drain the life from the Grim, leaving them withered husks. Ever since then we have become aware of John's changes. We believe that John may have undergone a similar process such as this, most likely between the time he left home and when he arrived at Beacon. Do you know what will happen to him? Pyrrha pleaded with the teachers. Glinda bit her lip, unsure of what to say, causing Ozpin to step forward, that we are not entirely sure about. We are dealing with powerful, ancient magics that go beyond our current scientific understanding. What is currently happening to John may be more of a contest of his individual will than anything else. He may be able to wrest control from this spirit, or he may be absorbed by the spirit, disappearing into its subconscious. A fate that befell many of Ozma's hosts. And should he fail to contain this other soul he is fighting, then a being of similar power may be the only thing capable of stopping him. Pyrrha opened her mouth to protest, saying that John wouldn't lose, but she knew that would have been a lie. She had literally just said John was becoming more and more dangerous. But even so, in her heart she believed that John was still a good person. That he could take control of his powers and the changes happening to him. It was a desperate hope, fleeting and fading with every moment, but still clinging to life nonetheless. Looking back at Amber's unconscious body, a thought came to her. Wait, if this machine is able to transfer Amber's powers to me, can't we use it to transfer whatever spirit is in John out of him? The professors were surprised by Purah's idea, and Ironwood brought his hand to his chin, thinking about this. It's possible. But remember, this machine does not transfer powers, but aura. It would literally rip John's soul out, most likely killing him. Then what about the person who tried to steal the maiden's power in the first place? Pyrrha frantically asked. They obviously have some way of stealing magic. No. Ozpin snapped at her, slamming his cane onto the ground, shocking everyone present. I'm sorry, but it is imperative that those we fight never get their hands on a power such as John's. They only seek war and destruction, and they would rather let the spirit take John over completely than try and save him. Miss Nikos, I understand what you are going through, believe me. Sometimes. There are those we cannot save, no matter how much we want to. Pyrrha looked absolutely shattered at Ozpin's refusal, causing him to sigh. But Ironwood interrupted, drawing all eyes to him. Were we to have enough time to study John and his powers, perhaps we could gain a better understanding of what is happening to him, and how to save him. Pyrrha lit up at this, while Ozpin glared disapprovingly at General. Really? Pyrrha excitedly asked. Ironwood put up a hand, causing her to pause. I can offer no guarantees. Only that Atlas has made many strides in the study of not only aura, but of the maidens as well. If there is someone who can figure out what is going on, it is my science team. Ironwood then scowled at Pyrrha. But even then, would your team leader want to give up his abilities? Power is corrupting, and as Ozpin said, only a being of similar capabilities would be able to stop him. Would you be able to fight him even if it was to save him? I'll need to think about this, Pyrrha said, deflating a bit. She needed to truly see how far John has fallen. But if John were to lose control, could she fight him? Was she strong enough to do that? You have an important decision before you. Ozpin nodded. Both for yourself and for the fate of your leader. I advise that you take time to think on this matter. But understand that before the vital festival is over, we will need your answer. Pyrrha didn't respond. Instead, she placed a hand on the pod containing Amber, and stared deeply at the sleeping maiden. She didn't know what the best choice was, or if there even was an option, to save John. It was the following day and the crowds of Amity Arena were roaring as the singles matches began. 8 fighters stood side by side along the Coliseum floor, the most important being Penny, Sun, Mercury, Yang, and John. It was a shock to many, including John himself, for him to be picked for the singles matches, but Pyrrha had said she was not feeling 100% and that John would stand a better chance than she would. John knew that was a lie, but didn't call her out on it. John could sense something was wrong with Pyrrha. Indecision, fear, and anxiety bled off her. With his empathetic senses, it was impossible for him not to notice. Especially because all of these emotions were specifically directed towards him. John didn't know what occurred yesterday, but something happened during her talk with the headmaster to affect her this badly. Scowling, John wondered what the headmaster said to her, if he hurt her at all. That sent another spike of anger through him. If the headmaster thinks he can play games with Pyrrha, he was mistaken. Pyrrha was his, and he would destroy anything that would take her from him. Before John could continue on this train of thought, the holographic screens of the area selected the next matchup. Mercury Black and Yang Xiaolong. Professor Port boomed over the speakers. With that, John began to make his way off the stage, until he sensed something strange once more. Glancing at Mercury, he felt the same smug, deceptive aura that he radiated during their fight in combat class. The boy was planning something. John considered going to Yang to warn her, but ultimately decided not to. Yang always had a terrible habit of running headfirst into an issue and paying for it later. Mount Glen, the breach, there were multiple examples of her nearly getting taken out because she couldn't control her anger. Passion gave strength, Yes, but only if one can control their passion, not the other way around. Either Yang would overcome this challenge, and grow from it, or she would fail, and due to the decidedly non-lethal measures of the school, learn from the failure. And so, John swiftly made his way to his team, all sitting in their own front row seats. He could still sense the apprehension from Pyrrha as he sat down with his team, but he didn't say anything. He sighed, and hoped the fight would be a good diversion. Yang Xiaolong, stand down. The Atlesian soldiers ordered, rifles trained on the huntress. What? Why? Yang called out as Mercury began screaming, his leg bent the wrong way from Yang's Ember Cecilia. Everyone around John sported looks of surprise, horror, and even hatred towards Yang for crippling the silver-haired boy. Even the rest of Team JNPR were horrified by their friend's action. John's reaction was far less animated than everyone else. Pathetic. John mumbled out, quiet enough that only Pyrrha beside him heard. His partner turned to him, her mouth agape in horror at what John just said. What? She was barely able to whisper out. John's gaze quickly flickered to his partner, before turning back to the scene in front of them. Yang had already proven herself the victor. I had hoped she would have better mastery of her passion than this. Such feelings would be better served elsewhere. An image of the old woman Treya from his dream appeared in his mind as he recited the philosophy. Psychotic urges like this have no purpose. Cruelty begets cruelty. Actions like this will reverberate and have more far-reaching repercussions than we know. Briefly, John wondered if this still would have occurred if he decided to warn Yang that Mercury was planning something, but he shunted those thoughts from his mind. Aside from the pointlessness of pondering, what ifs, whatever machinations Black was planning most likely ended when Yang maimed him. Ultimately feeling curious, John extended his senses out to the fighters to gauge Yang's thoughts. Strangely enough, Yang was not expressing the overt passion and rage he was expecting, but instead bled fear and confusion. Meanwhile Mercury continued to emanate his smug, confident aura. That was curious. Was this part of Mercury's plan? If so, why would he want to cripple himself? What purpose would that serve? Before John could dive any deeper, he felt pain once more. The echoes of anger, fear, and condemnation from the audience began to overwhelm his empathetic senses. All of this negative emotion was making him hungry. Growling, John stood and began to make his way out of the arena. John. He heard Pyrrha call out behind him, but John didn't stop. Conflicted, Pyrrha turned to see the Atlas soldiers leading Yang off the stage while a pair of medics moved Mercury onto a stretcher. Seeing nothing she could really do here, she stood and made for her partner, the rest of her team following as well. As Pyrrha followed John out of the arena, her mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts a minute, replaying the scene that just happened, and John's response to it. Yang was impulsive and violent, but she'd never been so needlessly cruel before. And John had no empathy for either Yang or Mercury. No care for the fact that their friend may have just committed a crime or that a fellow student was crippled. He didn't even seem to regret his words, like when he allows his emotions get the better of him while talking to his team. Pyrrha sighed. Was John really so far fallen? Was he really losing the battle against Nihilus so badly? While Pyrrha was lost in her thoughts, Team JNPR eventually made their way off of the arena, and to Beacon's fairgrounds. John, now sufficiently away from the crowd, was able to regain control of his inner emotions and hunger. Reaching a rather isolated spot by the cafeteria exterior, John allowed himself to stop moving as his team finally caught up with him. John. Pyrrha called out. What happened? Why did you leave so suddenly? Turning to his team, John crossed his arms and said, there was nothing we could have done there. My match isn't until later tonight, and Atlas is going to be watching Yang like a hawk. One has to wonder what they plan to do with her. Ren commented. That was a very public display. One that could even get the entire tournament cancelled. I doubt it. Nora shrugged. I mean, accidents happen all the time, right? And we all know what we're getting into every time we get into a fight. Besides, the festival is too big for it to be cancelled after one incident. She then turned to face her leader, and that's why, John, you gotta be in tip-top shape for tonight's match. What happened with Yang is a shame, but do not let your concern for her hold you back. You're now fighting for Beacon's honor. Ren nodded in agreement, misconstruing John's actions for one of concern for their friend. Ren, Nora. Pyrrha interrupted. I'm sorry, but could I speak with John for a moment? Alone. She emphasized. Ren raised a confused eyebrow, while Nora excitedly gasped. She grabbed Ren by the arm and started dragging him away. Sure thing. Come on, Ren, let's go back to the fairgrounds. I'll win you another stuffed animal. Before the Mistralian boy could protest, Nora dragged him away, leaving John and Pyrrha together alone. The two stared at one another, not saying anything as an uncomfortable silence fell down around them. After several seconds of waiting for Pyrrha to work up the nerve to say something, John lost his patience and spoke first. Something's bothering you, he stated, not asked. Pyrrha sighed, unsurprised that John knew something was wrong. Yes, she responded sadly. It was John's turn to sigh, running his hand through his unkempt hair. Look, Pyr, I know that I've been difficult lately. But despite everything, you've still been there for me. And it's only fair that I be there for you. So, tell me what's wrong. Pyrrha stepped to the side, breaking eye contact with John and instead looked to a tree full of orange leaves, currently succumbing to fall. John, do you believe in destiny? She asked. John stepped beside her and glanced at the tree as well as he considered his answer. But John felt his stomach start to drop. He had a bad feeling about this conversation. I would like to think that as individuals, we have a choice, that we have free will. But now, with everything that's happened, I can't help but think that there's something more. Something pulling the strings, and we are all beholden to its will. Pyrrha nodded in agreement. I used to think that destiny wasn't a kind of inescapable fate, but rather a final goal that one worked to their whole life. But recently, I've started to see destiny in a way similar to you. So many things have been happening, falling into place in such a way that there's no way it can be just luck or coincidence. The sinking feeling in John's stomach worsened as Pyrrha continued on. I used to think it was my destiny to become a huntress. To protect the world. But for a little while now, I haven't cared about that goal. She then turned to face her leader once more, eyes conflicted. I have a new goal. To save you. She said she would do anything to save John, even if that meant stopping him by force. John's senses went into overdrive as he put together what was happening. Pyrrha was now standing against him. What did Ozpin say to you? He growled out. He was going to tear Ozpin apart for this. Pyrrha shook her head. It's not about what Ozpin said, John. It's about what you've said. What you've done. John, do you not even realize that you never stopped to ask yourself if Yang was okay? She's our friend John and you don't even care. Why should he care, was all John thought in response. Yang was a fool who refused to learn. John's thoughts were cut off as Pyrrha cried out once more. And it's not just that. John, were you ever actually planning on telling me that your powers could drain Grimm? John opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He hadn't planned on telling Pyrrha about it. His mouth shut closed, and he broke eye contact with her. That was enough of an answer for Pyrrha. Tell me, John, how much haven't you told me? How much of what you told me was a lie? Pyrrha pleaded, but John still had no answer. John, don't you see what your power has done to you? Don't you remember what happened to Nihilus in your dreams? The same exact thing is happening to you now. You need help, John, and I don't know if I alone can help you. If you really, truly, want to stop Nihilus, then you should come with me to speak with General Ironwood. The General thinks he may be able to help you, John. For the briefest of moments, John's surprise took over all other emotions. Would the General actually be able to help him? To get this hunger under control? She lies. The voice of Nihilus spoke within John's mind. What? John thought back. No, she wouldn't. Pyrrha said she would help me. She has betrayed you. The voice pushed. They do not want to help you. They want to use you. Make you into their slave. Visions flashed within John's mind. Images of what is, what was, and what has yet come to pass. He saw images of Ozpin, Ironwood, Glinda, and an unknown man with spiky black hair and red eyes speaking in Ozpin's office. They spoke of John, and how they could use him. How they could manipulate him into fighting a grand war against a timeless enemy. John saw flashes of a possible future, fighting against hordes of Grimm alongside Pyrrha and the others, hacking their way into the deepest parts of Grimm-controlled territory, to fight a being as suffused in the dark side as he was. Then flashed another possibility. One where John was in a cell in Atlas, placed in some kind of coma while scientists examined him. They poked and prodded him, tearing apart his insides for insight into his power. All the while, the mask of Darth Nihilus was held in the hands of General Ironwood and Professor Ozpin, who contemplated what to do with such a terrible thing. This only made him rage. Who were Ozpin and his cohorts to try and put him in bondage? To use and manipulate him? To wrap him in chains? That was unforgivable. This power was his, and his alone. He would not give it up to someone who was more machine than man. No. John viciously snapped at his partner, causing her to recoil. You just want to sell me out to Ozpin. To Ironwood. No, John, please. This is only to help you. Pyrrha cried out. How could he not see this? It's like she didn't even know who he was anymore. Liar. He roared out, reaching out with the force at the same time. Pyrrha yelped as John yanked her forward, right into his grasp. John's hands gripped onto Pyrrha's upper arms like a vice, sending waves of pain even through her aura. You won't turn against me. John snarled as Pyrrha watched his eyes shift yellow. I won't let them take you away from me. You are mine. Pyrrha's shock at what was happening was quickly replaced by fear and pain as John's grip tightened even more on her. John, stop. Let go, you're hurting me. She begged as tears formed at the corners of her eyes. It was at that moment, staring into John's face of pure hatred and anger, that Pyrrha started to feel her aura drain as black and red lightning started to crackle where John held her. Sheer terror flooded Pyrrha's system as her survival and combat instinct kicked in. Let go. Pyrrha screamed back as her semblance grabbed onto what metal she could find, primarily the belts of his black assassin outfit. It wasn't much, but it was enough metal to allow Pyrrha to fling John backwards. Not expecting the attack, John's hand slipped off of Pyrrha as he went flying, right into a stone pillar. Pyrrha threw him back hard enough that the column cracked as John flopped to the ground, barely moving. There was a brief moment of shocked silence as Pyrrha tried to comprehend what just happened. As she did, John unsteadily pushed himself to his knees, barely able to support himself. Pyrrha saw that he was shaking. "Ya John," the redhead meekly called out. While she didn't want to admit it, Pyrrha wanted to just leave him right then and there. He attacked her. And she was scared of him. John's head slowly rose, and she saw that tears were now pouring down his face. John's eyes were unfocused, but saw both of the dark, purple bruises Pyrrha sported on her arms where he grabbed her. You hurt her. The voice inside his head spoke once more. She was going to leave you, so you hurt her. I didn't mean to. John sputtered out, horrified by what he had done. As he pushed himself up, he took one step towards Pyrrha with his hand extended, causing her to flinch and take a step back. He then saw the look of pure terror she had when she looked at him, and it broke his heart. I'm sorry. Oh Dust, I'm sorry. John turned and immediately began sprinting away. He didn't know where he was running, and he didn't care who saw him. He just needed to get away. John didn't care about the random Haven student he knocked to ground as he continued to sprint through the fairgrounds. He ignored their startled cries, as well as the calls of condemnation and confusion from other bystanders. He didn't even care as he plowed through an unfortunate student who was acting as a waiter for one of the food stalls, sending plates of food crashing to the ground. Meanwhile, Pyrrha sprinted after John, trying to chase her partner down, deftly dancing around the trail of destruction that John left behind. She may have been scared, but stopping a rampaging John was more important. As she ran after him, Ren and Nora, who were in the middle of walking around the fair, saw the commotion surrounding their teammates and immediately burst into action as well. It didn't take long for them to catch up to Pyrrha as she continued to run after their leader. They didn't even have time to ask what was going on when John bowled into a familiar black and white themed faunus. RWB of Team RWBY along with Ruby's uncle Kiro were currently walking through the fairgrounds as well as they decided to give Yang space following her match. Blake didn't even have time to react as John slammed full force into her, taking her straight to the ground. The Waitrose duo jumped back in surprise as John and Blake hit the floor, their aura absorbing any actual damage. Arg. John, what the hell? Blake snapped as she regained her bearings, looking up at John, who was currently on top of her. Her anger quickly gave way to confusion as she saw John's face, one of fear and stained with tears. John. Are you oh? John didn't let the faunus finish as he stood up once more and started running again. John, stop. Pyrrha called out as she and the rest of Team JNPR ran after him, causing the RWB trio to join in as well. Unknown to them, however, the scene also attracted the attention of two specific students. A pair of bright amber eyes and a pair of heterochromatic pink and brown eyes watched with interest as Cinder and Neo, both currently hidden thanks to Neo's semblance, as they waited until they could push to the next phase of their plan. Soon enough, John's flight reached its end as he ended up at Beacon's air dock, with nowhere to go except for a long dive down to the river below. All nearby students were giving the blonde a wide berth, with Atlas soldiers and droids moved to form a perimeter around him to keep him from making any more of a disturbance. John, what's going on? RWBY huffed as they were finally able to stop their sprint, teams RWB, NPR, and Kiro joining the Atlas soldiers in a circle around John. But John was incoherent, clutching his head as between his wails he was barely able to cry out. I didn't mean to. Eliciting only looks of confusion from everyone. John lost control and attacked me. Pyrrha supplied, causing those nearby to look and see the deep bruises on her arms. RWBY, Nora, and Ren gasped in horror, while Weiss and Blake turned their spiteful gazes back to John. Ignoring their looks, Pyrrha yelled out to her leader once more, John, please, calm down and we can talk about this. But John didn't hear her as he continued to break down. All John could focus on was the one phrase repeating in his head. He didn't mean to. He didn't mean to. He would never hurt Pyrrha. Never her. But you did hurt her. The voice inside his head hissed out once more. You were to protect her, but instead you hurt her. All because you were too weak. Shut up. John roared as the voice spoke, causing him to stumble closer to the edge of the air dock. Everyone gasped as John almost slipped off the cliff. John. This time it was RWBY who called out. Get away from the edge. Please just listen to us. But this only had the opposite effect as John inched even closer to the precipice. John blubbered out. I just want the voice to stop. Everyone except for Pyrrha and Kiro only looked at him with further confused looks as he spoke. Voice. What voice? Weiss was the one to ask. Pyrrha, however, ignored the question as she spoke once more. Do you hear him now, John? This caused John to look at his friends for the first time since this episode started, his eyes yellow and stained with tears. John didn't answer Pyrrha's question as he looked over his friends, his vision eventually fixing itself on Kiro, the scruffy old man with spiky black hair and red eyes from his vision, who was currently standing beside Pyrrha. You. John howled at him, causing Kiro to fall into a defensive stance. You turned her against me. Kiro's vision quickly flickered to Pyrrha before returning to John. Kid, he began as his hand reached for Harbinger on his back. Believe me when I say, you have done that yourself. John's hand returned to his head once more as he screamed. Once that bout had passed, John's eyes shot back up at everyone around him, wildly darting around. You all just want it. You're all here to take it, but this power is mine. John, what in the name of the brothers are you talking about? RWBY yelled back. It was at that moment that John's hand reached into his jacket. With a weak, fumbling grip, John pulled out the mask of Darth Nihilus. No one said anything as the mask appeared before them. Even just looking at the bone mask, they could feel it was wrong. The mask was terrifying. Unnatural. John. What is that? Pyrrha barely whispered, her eyes never leaving the mask. But John ignored her. He just stared deep into the eyes of the mask, much like he did when he first discovered it. All other noise around him had vanished as he looked. He could only hear the voice of Darth Nihilus as it said, you know what you must do to no longer be weak. Knowing what he had to do, John looked up at his friends, the family he made at Beacon. His eyes locked on Pyrrha, and could only smile sadly at her while tears continued to pour as he said, I just wanted to be a hero. And then John Arc put on the mask. Raw. John's shrill scream rang out over the campus, overtaking all other sounds. John. Pyrrha screamed as she ran forward to stop him. But before she could make any meaningful distance, she was blasted backwards by a wave of invisible force. The wave then hit everyone else, knocking them off of their feet and onto the ground. Staggered, the students began to slowly pick themselves up, when a black miasma enveloped the area. RWB and NPR looked around in confusion at the smoky's sudden appearance. Just as sudden as it appeared, the miasma shifted, flying all in a single direction. Following its movement, they saw with wide-eyed horror as the smoke coalesced around John, coating him in a pitch-black tar. The shadows spread all over John, completely covering his clothing and his face, only leaving a vaguely human-shaped mass of darkness before them. The darkness soon began to refine, shifting and twisting as the details filled in. From John's body came long, flowing black robes, his limbs wrapped similarly in all black. A matching hood covered John's head. In fact, the only part of John that wasn't jet black was the white and red mask on his face. John's new form fell to one knee, as if he wasn't used to standing. Everyone around John felt a chill go up their spines as they stared at John. The sheer amount of negative energy flowing off of him caused anyone who wasn't a trained huntsman or soldier to immediately turn and flee the scene. Malice, terror, and hunger radiated off of John. John. Ruby yelled out, shoving down her fear as she took a step towards her friend. But before she could go any further, a hand on her shoulder stopped. She turned and saw her uncle Kiro, his focused gaze not leaving John, keeping her from advancing. Kiro shook his head slightly as he drew Harbinger. It was then that John began to rise. He stood slowly, still unsteady as if he were learning how to move once more. Once he finished standing, John moved his hand in front of his face, examining his fingers and the back of his hand as he made a few experimental fists. Seemingly satisfied, John then looked up at his friends, nearly causing them to jump back in terror. Pyrrha stared into the pitch-black void of John's eyes, and she understood. This wasn't John in front of her. This was Nihilus. Nihilus took in the scene around him with a grim satisfaction. The Lord of Hunger did not know how many years he spent in that infernal prison, waiting until the Force would drive a potential host to him. And even after he found one, it had taken months more for Nihilus to turn John into a suitable host. Months of subtle manipulation, corruption, all to strengthen the boy and increase his connection to the dark side of the Force so he could become a vessel strong enough to hold Nihilus's soul. But now, the process was complete. The weak boy known as John Arc was gone, and only Darth Nihilus remained. Chapter 17. Legends. A long time ago, in a galaxy ravaged by war, Jedi exile Mitra Surik looked out of the bridge window of the Ravager, sadly taking in the devastation wrought upon the world of Telos IV. A planet that was scarred and despoiled by the horrors of war, once more exposed to inhuman cruelty and violence. Closing her eyes, she then brought her gaze to the one that caused all of this wanton destruction. Darth Nihilus, the feared Lord of Hunger, lied defeated before her, Visas, and Mandalore. No, that was wrong. Nihilus didn't cause all of this. He was but a pawn, a slave to his hunger whose hand was forced by their shared mentor. The ship then shook, the battle-scarred metal groaning as the force of nature that was holding it together was now dead. When she regained her balance, Mitra then saw Visas approach the body of her former master. Visas, what are you doing? Mitra asked. I have to see. The Miralukan whispered out. With the Force, and with my eyes. What the hell are you doing up there? We need to get off this ship. Now. Mandalore barked out as the ship groaned once more. Sensing that this was something Visas needed to do, Mitra put out a hand to silence Mandalore. Look upon his face, if it will bring you peace, Visas. Mitra then paused for a moment, considering her next actions. Then bring his mask to me. Visas knelt down before the body, pulling off the mask, and gazing in her former master's eyes for several seconds. She then stood, taking the mask with her as she approached the exile. What did you see when you looked at him? Mitra couldn't help but be curious herself. A man, nothing more. Visas shook her head, handing the mask of Darth Nihilus to Mitra. You are my master now. And I will follow wherever your path takes you. My path here is at an end. Mitra nodded. Then let this ship die, as it should have years ago. The trio turned and began to make their way off of the bridge. As they did, they paid no heed to the body of Darth Nihilus becoming one with the Force as a storm of red lightning and smoke destroyed it. Mitra pocketed the mask into her robe, one final trophy of the beast who died and was reborn on Malachor V. Although much weaker than when Nihilus wore it, Mitra could still sense the power of the dark side of the Force emanating from the mask, feeling it strengthening her connection to it. While Mitra had devoted herself to her return to the light, she knew that both the dark and the light had its purposes. Despite her betrayal, much of what Crea taught her rang true. The Force was the Force, and dark or light was all just titles. At least until Crea was stopped, she would bear the burden of the mask of Darth Nihilus on her. However, what neither Mitra nor Visas sensed, was that the mask carried not an echo of the Lord of Hunger, nor an imprint of his power, but the soul of the Dark Lord himself. Nihilus, far weakened by the destruction of his withered husk of a physical vessel, was barely cognizant as he was passed from his former apprentice to his antithesis. Nihilus felt his consciousness fading. He would not die, no the Sith magics he used to bound his soul to the mask would ensure that. But he would become dormant, practically comatose as his soul healed, naturally drawing upon the living force surrounding him. And so, as his perceptions of the world around him went dark, Darth Nihilus sent one last spiteful glare at his treacherous apprentice and the Jedi Knight who turned her. Nihilus then slept. Nihilus stirred as voices roused him from his slumber. He did not know for how long he slept. But for an immortal like Nihilus, time was irrelevant. Reaching out to get a sense of his surroundings, Nihilus found that his mask was in some kind of storage container or holocron. The voice outside of his prison spoke once more, though heavily muffled, as if they were speaking through a wall or underwater. Not many can claim they battled a Sith and lived. You're in rare company. One of the voices spoke, a clearly feminine voice. One that Nihilus could feel the Force coming from. Then the second voice spoke. This one was not colored by the Force, which made it difficult for Nihilus to even determine if it was a man or woman speaking. You took some hits. Any of them leave a mark. My injuries will heal soon enough. The first voice spoke. Nihilus then felt the woman touch the box he was stored within. I see now why Zare thought this box worth killing over. Thank the Force we stopped her. This box contains a Sith artifact. It was created centuries ago by a powerful Dark Lord called Darth Nihilus. This Darth Nihilus guy famous for anything, Nariel. The second spoke. Even through the box, Nihilus could feel the spike of fear in this Nariel. He exterminated nearly every Jedi centuries ago. It was the closest our order ever came to extinction, and it took great effort for us to rebuild. Nariel shook her head, and Nihilus could feel resolution well in her. I'll ensure that this relic remains safely hidden from Zare's allies. The Empire must never find this artifact. With its power, they could possibly turn the tide of the war against the Republic. Thank you once again, Voidhound. We saved countless lives today. Nariel then grabbed the strongbox as she prepared to leave. Let's do it again sometime. This Voidhound winked. Nariel chuckled. If you were a little more serious-minded, you'd make a fine Jedi. I'll take that as a compliment. Voidhound smirked. Smiling, Nariel placed a hand on her heart and bowed. Goodbye. May the Force protect you. Nihilus felt Nariel carry his container to what was most likely her ship, followed by the unmistakable feeling of hyperspace travel as the Jedi began her journey. Flying her freighter, Nariel performed random hyperspace jump after random hyperspace jump. It was simple enough for Nihilus to ascertain her plan. She was going to the unknown regions, far beyond explored space in order to hide Nihilus's mask from any who would seek it. It was indeed a simple plan, but one that would be effective nonetheless. If his mask was placed on an unexplored wild planet, it would be a very long time before someone found it. And so, using what little energy he was able to regain over his years in hibernation, Nihilus projected his soul from the mask, summoning a ghost of the Force. Nihilus knew he didn't have long. His power was weak, extremely weak. During his slumber he had barely been able to absorb the force around him, and he knew he couldn't sustain this form for long. He also knew that the Jedi Nariel Pridance would not fall to corruption. At least not in the time frame that he had. Corruption was a slow, and insidious thing, especially slow on Jedi who had learned to shun their desires and emotions. To her credit, Nariel sensed something was wrong almost immediately. Running from the cockpit of her ship, her face fell as she saw the ghostly specter of Darth Nihilus looking right back at her. Without hesitation, Nariel drew her lightsaber and swung. She was fast, but not fast enough. Before her blade could connect, Nihilus let loose a torrent of orange lightning against her, draining her of her very life. Over the course of only a few seconds, Nariel went from a beautiful young woman into a desiccated corpse. Meanwhile, Nihilus felt his strength start to return, but it still was not enough. He was far from the power he had when he was starving to death above Telos, let alone how powerful he was in his prime. And what power he had drained would not stay if he kept exerting himself. If he were to continue to survive, he would have to return to hibernation once more. Quickly, Nihilus looked to the cockpit of the starship, and with a wave of his hand, manipulated the controls. The starship's distress beacon was activated, and with luck and guidance from the Force, someone would detect the ship and Nihilus would be able to escape into the greater galaxy once more. His plan set in motion, Nihilus released his control over his mortal projection, returning to his slumber so he could continue to gather his strength. As Nihilus slept, time continued to flow. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. So far out in the vastness of space, the chances of someone finding a single, lost freighter were far from likely. But through sheer astronomical chance or through the will of the Force, the freighter was happened upon by a pair of smugglers who were running spies for the gang known as the Wavelength Gale. The duo explored the ship, taking everything of value, before continuing on to their home base on the nearby planet Volok. Unfortunately for the Lord of Hunger, none of the smugglers possessed enough of a connection to the Force to rouse him from his slumber. It was on Volok that the smugglers discovered the mask, but had no knowledge of what it truly was. And so, everything was catalogued and organized in the smugglers' base in preparation for later sale. This would not come to pass however, because before they had the chance to sell their ill-gotten goods, the Wavelength Gale gang would be ambushed by the Republic Navy. Rather than face guaranteed imprisonment, the smugglers took their chances and tried to run the Republic blockade. This resulted in only the death of all the smugglers, and with their deaths, the loss of all knowledge of where their treasures were hidden. And so, the mask of Darth Nihilus was once more lost, trapped within a cargo hold on an unknown planet. It was here the mask continued to sit as time marched forever onward. Years turned to centuries, and centuries to millennia. Nihilus did not know what occurred on this planet, or that he was even on a planet for that matter. It wasn't until Nihilus felt the presence of several figures around him that he began to awaken and return to consciousness. Really, Sando, a double cross. Curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal. Nihilus heard a voice deadpan. Stretching out his perception, Nihilus did not sense a creature, but instead a cold body of machinery and electricity. It was a droid speaking, albeit one of high intelligence and agency, with a heavily armored light blue-colored body, and a helmeted head that had a single glass visor instead of face. Beside him, were several other droids, all of similar design, but of different colors. Your sarcastic wit may be cute, Alpha, but it's not enough to save you. Now hand over the artifact, and you and your friends get to leave. Sando spoke in a high-pitched, whining alien language that immediately identified her as a Rodian. Behind her stood several other humanoids of varying races. It was easy to identify them as some kind of mercenary or pirate band. Oh god, the meatbag called you cute. A black-colored droid beside the Alpha spoke with a feminine voice that dripped annoyance. Listen here, Bug Eyes, we didn't bust our ass helping you get here for you to just leave us high and dry. Now I'm giving you one last chance. Turn around, walk away, and I don't turn you into a blaster-ridden corpse. You should listen to Beta, Sando. She may be a crazy bitch, but you know how fucking lethal she is. Alpha added on. You're making a big mistake if you think you can take us down. A new voice cut in once more, this one belonging to a human male, that carried a tone of regularity and nobility. No, I think both of you have made a mistake. The heads turned to the newest speaker, a young man with pasty white skin, and medium-length black hair, along with a group of warriors behind him. While the boy wasn't worthy of becoming even a Sith neophyte, he was just barely Force-sensitive enough to awaken the Dark Lord. Nihilus could sense that he was ambitious, cruel, and sought out the path to becoming a Sith. Colin Islow. Pampered noble and wannabe Sith. Sando spat out. Didn't you learn your lesson the last time my boys kicked you off planet? Oh, but I did learn, Sando. Colin said with a savage grin as his allies all drew heavy repeaters and aimed at both Sando and her crew and the droids. I learned to bring more than enough firepower to wipe your pathetic groups off the face of the galaxy. Half of Sando's group and half of the droids aimed their guns at Colin and his allies. Oh ho ho. A dark gray droid cackled out as it leveled what looked like a rocket launcher. Looks like we have ourselves a Tatooine standoff. How absolutely delicious, muahahaha. Kinit Omega. Alpha then turned to a green-colored droid beside him. What's it looking like, D? D, or Delta, simply responded. I calculate a 37.20% chance that we will make it out of this situation unharmed. Never tell me the odds. Beta hissed out as she aimed her two blaster pistols, one at Sando and the other at Colin. With violence about to erupt, the three groups were so completely focused on one another that they didn't seem to notice a new form taking shape in the cargo hold. Behind the multicolored droids, the spectral form of Darth Nihilus rose once more. Sando's face fell as she was the first to see the ghost appear. What the hell? She cried out as she raised her blaster pistol and aimed at the Dark Lord. But Nihilus was too fast. His body phasing through the droids, Nihilus dug his hand into the heart of the Rodian pirate, and with a simple thought completely drained her of her life. Several of her faster pirates swiveled and fired their blasters, but they would do nothing to a being of pure force. Nihilus then roared as orange lightning shot out from him, slamming into all of the pirates and draining them of all of their life force, killing them instantly. The droids lowered their guns out of sheer awe at what just happened, while Colin only threw himself onto the ground in supplication. My Lord Nihilus. The nobleman cried out as he fell to his feet. My lord, I have come here with my people, the Apex Society, to save you and ask for your favor. Please, grant me the power of the fork. Colin's voice was cut off as Nihilus appeared before him and unleashed his powers. Colin looked down in horror as his and his followers' life force was drained by the Dark Lord. Tilting his head up, Colin stared at his lord in confusion and horror as he died. Meanwhile, Nihilus didn't even give the boy a second thought. The boy had a connection to the Force, no matter how minuscule, and Nihilus was hungry. As every living organic died, the colored droids kept their blasters trained on the ghost, but didn't pull their triggers. Warning. I calculate a 0.01% chance that our weapons will be effective against this adversary. Delta, the green droid spoke. Yeah, thanks D, I got that. Alpha snapped out as he tried to figure out what to do. Nihilus didn't pay the droids any mind. He could not sense them, nor could he drain them, so they were worthless to him. With no sentience left, and only one barely being force-sensitive, Nihilus knew he couldn't sustain his form for too long. And so Nihilus decided to return to sleep, allowing his spectral form to collapse as his mask fell to the ground. As the mask harmlessly clattered to the ground, all of the droids kept their blasters trained on it for several more seconds. Once it became clear that the mask wasn't going to do anything, Alpha was the first to lower his gun and say, well, that just happened. Any suggestions on what to do with this thing? Suggestions? Beta incredulously asked. Why are we even talking about this? Did you not just see the ghost turn those guys in Bantha jerky? We put this thing back in its box, and get the hell out. If I may, Beta. Delta interjected. Knowledge of the mosque's existence and location seems to have been leaked to the wider galaxy by Sando's boys, as exemplified by both our presence and the presence of Colin Islow's Apex Society. If we leave the mask here, there is a very high chance that the mask will be claimed by someone else after we leave. Why do we not take it? Omega asked with his nefarious accent. Did you see the amount of power this mask has? It is absolutely diabolical. Or at the very least, we could sell it for quite the pretty penny. Alpha shook his head. Beta, if Omega ever suggests something like that again, you have my permission to shoot him. Beta then turned and flicked the safety off her blaster as she faced Omega, somehow smiling despite her lack of a face. In fact, you can shoot him twice. Alpha continued. No, we can't just leave it here for someone else to take. We can't let this thing get back to the Empire. Trust me, Vader is the last type of person who should get something like this. So what's the plan, boss? Beta asked, her last word dripping with sarcasm. Alpha thought for a moment before deciding. We take the mask and go further into the unknown regions. Way beyond any charted star system. We find some random rock and dump it there. While I do not have enough data on the unknown regions to project a threat rating should anything find it there, I can calculate that this plan has a high chance of success for hiding the mask from the Empire. Delta added on. Sounds fine to me. Beta shrugged, going along with the flow. Then we're all in agreement. Alpha declared. Omega protested. I didn't agree to anything. Everyone who matters is in agreement. Church snapped as he picked up the mask and put it back in its box. Now come on, everyone back to the mother of invention. The sooner we get rid of this thing, the sooner I can wipe my memory and forget all of this happened. The droids hurriedly returned to their starship, piling in as they took off from the planet. At Alpha's orders, they then began a series of random hyperspace jumps. Eventually they reached a completely unexplored system, with one habitable planet whose main feature strangely enough was a moon that seemed to have been shattered. What the hell happened there? Beta asked as she stared at the fractured stellar body. Probably an asteroid or something hit it, who cares? Alpha grumbled. Give me a sitrep D, we good to drop the payload. Delta nodded his head. All calculations are completed, approach vector is locked for a low orbit drop-off. Aren't you worried about any natives finding this thing? Beta asked, tilting her head. Fuck 'em. Alpha simply responded. However, he then felt Beta's blank stare at the back of his head, causing him to groan and turn to his green companion. Hey D, are there any spaceflight capable races on this planet? Preliminary scans have found no evidence of spaceflight capable sentient life. However, there is some evidence of primitive natives who have yet to industrialize. Delta simply responded. See. Just a bunch of low-tech natives. Alpha gestured to the planet. That mask isn't getting off-world for a long time. Now prepare for atmospheric drop Delta. Delta's metallic fingers began to quickly tap on his console. Beginning planetary approach now. Venting stern cargo hold. And the package is away, Alpha. Alpha nodded. Good. Now let's get the hell out of here. The mother of invention listed to the side as it pushed its sublight thrusters to the max before hyperdriving back to civilized space. Meanwhile, the strongbox containing the mask of Darth Nihilus rocketed downwards toward the planet the locals had dubbed Remnant. The Durasteel storage box maintained its structure as it burned through re-entry, until it eventually made planetfall with a cacophonous explosion. Petros Chrysos was a simple man. A monk of the Church of the Two Brothers, Petros eked out a meager, but pious existence for the 2 decades he had been alive. Petros considered himself a good man. He made sure that his flock were clothed, fed, and heard the good word of the two brothers regularly. Incidentally, his position as a monk had made him something of a leader in his village located along the eastern Sanus Mountains despite his young age. While he normally enjoyed such a position of power, it often came responsibilities that he never asked for. That included investigating the star that had fallen the night previous. As was tradition with monks of the two brothers, Petros had his aura unlocked and knew how to fight, in order to better protect his flock from the grim and other such threats. Sighing, Petros hoofed his way over a hill where the star had impacted. As he made it over the cliff, Petros' eyes widened with shock. The verdant green forest that once covered this land was completely destroyed, charred black and ruined by the impact of the falling star. It was like the brothers themselves had come down from the heavens, and ripped out the land that was once here. As he looked over the devastation, Petros saw something that caught his eye. At the center of the crater was the star itself. It was a strange box or cube, In fact, it looked like a storage chest, but only made of some strange metal rather than wood and iron. Apprehensively, Petros approached the box. A quick tap with his finger revealed that the box was not hot, but actually rather cool to the touch. Seeing it was safe to handle, the monk began to examine the box, eventually finding what looked like a latch to open it. Pressing a button, the chest unlocked and slowly opened, revealing to Petros a bone-white mask inside, with 2 red stripes beneath the eyes. Petros found the mask a curious thing, and began to study its features. What he didn't know was that in turn, the mask was studying him. Nihilus had once more come into consciousness when the monk approached. Unlike before, however, his previous meal of the aspiring Sith acolyte and the pirates sated his hunger just enough that he didn't immediately consume this man. And he was glad he didn't, as what appeared to be a simple baseline human in front of him was anything but. The man had a connection to the Force, but not like what Nihilus was used to seeing in Force adepts. The man examining the mask had no Force sensitivity to speak of, but the Force solidified around him, creating an aura that enhanced his durability and strength, not unlike the techniques of Force Barrier and Force Valor. It was a very curious thing, even to a being such as Nihilus. What was the cause of this? Could the midi-chlorians have evolved into something different on this world? Was this offshoot of humanity a completely Force-sensitive species, such as the Mirialukans or the ancient Sith, or even the Rakata he recalled Revan speaking of once during the Jedi Civil War? Regardless, this was different. This man and his people could feed Nihilus, more than a non-Force sensitive being, but less than someone who was fully sensitive. Luckily for Nihilus, his previous meal had sated him enough that for now he was no longer a vicious beast, feral, with no thought beyond its next meal. And as such, Nihilus decided to hold off on consuming the man. He could lead Nihilus to others who could sustain the Dark Lord's appetite. It was a simple matter for Nihilus to use the Force to convince the monk to take the mask with him. And while Nihilus could feed on the young man and his strange connection to the Force, Nihilus did not believe he could be a worthy vessel for his soul. He would have to wait until the Force brought someone to him else. Meanwhile, Petros found the mask to be quite terrifying, but awe-inspiring at the same time. Both beautiful and dreadful. A balance between 2 sides, much like the 2 brother gods, though obviously more on the side of the brother of darkness. Petros looked back at the storage box, and then at the devastation around him once more. This had to be a gift from the gods, an artifact dedicated to them. He had to take the mask back to his monastery and show it to the abbot and other monks. And so, Petros quickly placed the mask back into the box and closed it. With his aura-enhanced strength, Petros was more than strong enough to lift the box to his shoulder and begin the arduous journey back to his mountain monastery. The elderly Grand Master Petros of the Temple of Shadows sat upon his throne, gazing at the mask he had found so many years ago. Crossing his now decrepit fingers, he began to almost gleefully chuckle at the memories the mask brought upon. So much changed in his life when he found the mask. When he first showed the mask to his fellow monks those decades ago, they found the mask an interesting curiosity, but left Petros to his devices with it. It did not take long for Petros to realize that the mask was indeed an artifact of the Brother of Darkness, once the mask began to whisper to him. At first he was scared, terrified even of what it spoke of, but soon he found the wisdom of its words. It taught him the ways of darkness, of how to break free from the chains that society and the followers of light and order would impose on them. Many of the other monks did not believe in Petros when he tried to awaken them. They saw his words as blasphemy. Though the ones who did choose to follow were gifted with knowledge of darkness as well. They learned to hide in the shadows, to hunt those who offended them. It was a simple matter for them to eliminate their former brothers and sisters who refused to follow the new way. And the mask only wanted one thing in return. One simple thing: sacrifices. Souls who would be offered up to the avatar of the Dark God. At first, monks and followers who refused the new god were sacrificed. Once they were all gone, the monks began hunting for travelers and vagabonds that would not be missed. But Petros knew that if they simply continued their path of random violence, it would attract the ire of the outside world. And no amount of blessing from their Dark Lord would allow them to withstand their united fury. So instead of attacking any and all who would stray too close to the monastery, Petros began taking contracts from the kingdoms and many smaller villages to hunt down and kill their enemies. If possible, they would capture their targets alive, bring them to the monastery, and offer them to the mask. The monastery had completely transformed. No longer were the monks teachers and protectors who spread the word of the two brothers. Instead, they had become hunters, assassins who killed for the honor of the Dark Brother. They were now a death cult of assassins, infamous across Remnant for their tenacity, brutality, and most importantly their lethality. For years Petros and his fellow acolytes hunted across Remnant. And when their physical forms began to fail, they trained the next generation of assassins to continue their dark ways. And now, with the world of Remnant embroiled in its so-called Great War, business was, as they say, booming. Petros had lost count of how many contracts they had gotten from this war. How many military officers, politicians, and more across Mantle, Mistral, Vale, and Vacuo had died by the blades of his students. An explosion outside of the monastery rocked both the building and Petros out of his reminiscing. The Grand Master Assassin then heard hurried footsteps rapidly approaching his position. Bursting his way into the inner sanctum, a young monk still in the midst of his training ran to Petros. "Grand Master," the boy cried out, not bothering to catch his breath. "Vale's army is here. They are destroying everything and will breach the outer gate in but a few minutes." Despite his impending doom, Petros couldn't help but feel a wry smile appear on his face. "So, the warrior King Osmond has finally grown tired of our presence." Despite his ancient age, Petros stood tall, and reached for a sword at his side. "Come, child. Gather your brothers and sisters, and we shall honor our Lord by dying well." General Alexandre Arc stood stern-faced as the battering ram worked its way on the monastery door, rain pattering down on his dented and scarred armor. Many nobles and generals believed in always wearing a pristine suit of armor, but General Alexandre saw every mar and dent as a badge of honor earned on the battlefield. His gaze then turned to the pile of freshly made corpses that were gathered up from the previous engagement. The exterior guards of this temple were terrible opponents already, each single assassin killing a dozen of his men before being put down. The general didn't know how many cultists called this accursed temple home, but he knew that the cost of taking it was going to be heavy. With a deafening crash, the wooden doors of the monastery were broken open. With a nod of dour determination, Alexandre drew his sword, Crocia Morse, and turned to his soldiers. "Men and women of Vale, brace yourselves for a battle the likes of which none of you have ever seen. King Osmond has tasked us with the unenviable duty of removing these blighted cultists from this world. For too long these murderers and marauders have lived under the guise of holy men and women, killing any and all for their blasphemous rituals. But no more. We of Vale are here now to stop this evil. And though it will be a grim task, one that will claim the lives of many here, know that what we do today we do not just because it was ordered, but because it is what's right. What's just." General Alexandre raised his sword into the air, drawing the cheers of all his soldiers. "Now come. For death and glory. For Vale and the king." Extending his shield, General Alexandre Arc led the charge into the Temple of Shadows. Much like he had assumed, the assault into the temple was a costly one. Every assassin and cultist they ran into was absurdly fast and skilled, even when aura was put into consideration. Not to mention the sheer amount of traps and fortifications within the temple made every step potentially lethal. Spike pits, razor wires, poison darts, Alexandre lost count of how many men he lost to impalement due to a misplaced foot activating some hidden pressure plates. And as was their way of war, the assassins never struck them from the open. When the soldiers of Vale were most vulnerable or distracted, assassins would strike, killing dozens of men in an instant. Several of these assassins weren't even fully fledged warriors, but youngsters probably barely in their teens. It ached the general's heart to kill one so young, especially when he had a son of similar age, but these cultists were a plague who could be afforded no quarter. The king wanted this temple destroyed, and it would be destroyed. Soon enough, the general and his men reached the temple's inner sanctum, bloodied and hairy, down scores of soldiers already. That's when Alexandre saw Grand Master Petros Chrysos, the decrepit old fossil that led these blasphemers, surrounded by a dozen of his followers. His face was set with deep wrinkles, his eyes a sickly yellow, and he was clad in a dark black robe. General Arc. The master assassin rasped out. You are a bold one indeed. Save the pleasantries, Critias. By order of King Osmond, for crimes of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and crimes against humanity, I sentence you and your followers death. General Arc declared, pointing his sword at the man. Petros only smiled, revealing a mouth full of rotted teeth as he began cackling. Come then, great hero. We shall see which of us the gods shall favor tonight. Alexandre stood, resting all of his weight on his sword, panting and gasping for air. Around him were the bodies of the assassins, and nearly 100 dead soldiers of Baal. Each one a veteran warrior with years of experience and auras unlocked. To call the battle a massacre was not just an understatement, it was an insult to the dead. These monks were monsters, each and every one. And now they were all dead. Looking at the corpse of Petros Chrysos beneath him, the elderly monk having been eviscerated by Crociamors, it took every ounce of honor and self-control Alexandre had left to not spit upon the corpse. General. A voice spoke up behind Arc, causing him to rise and turn around. It was one of Arc's lieutenants, a young woman by the name of Isabel. Like all the other survivors, she was drenched in blood, and carried more than a few wounds. But luckily hers were shallow enough that she could still perform most of her duties. And despite her wounds, she was still able to snap off a perfect salute to the general. He had to respect the discipline. What's your report, Lieutenant? The general quickly asked. Dropping the salute, Isabel said, Sir, teams have finished their sweep of the temple. We believe all of the monks are accounted for. There were no prisoners. While military professionalism kept her from having any outward emotions when she reported, she couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction at the deaths of all the monks. Alexandre nodded his head. Good. May they all rot in hell. Gather the bodies and burn them. As he gave the order, however, something caught his eye. Within the center of the inner sanctum, beside some kind of altar or podium, Alexandre saw what looked like a grim mask. Scowling, Arc gripped Crociamors and moved for the center of the room. Noticing something was wrong, Isabel fell in line behind him. Once he reached the altar, Alexandre pushed the body of a cultist that was covering the mask aside. Bending down, Alexandre examined the mask that was on the ground. It was bone-white with red markings, not unlike a grim mask that he mistook it for. General. Lieutenant Isabel asked. What do you want to do with that? Destroy it. Thinking for a moment as the general observed the mask. He was here to destroy all traces of these monks and their dark religion. But there was something about this mask that he couldn't put his finger on that attracted him to it. It would be a terrible waste to just destroy it, Alexandre said. It would be a shame to have lost so much and not even have a trophy. Alexandre then pocketed the mask into his jacket as he turned back to the lieutenant. Now then, let's finish our job here, Lieutenant. Purge everything in this foul place. Everything shall be put to the torch and hammer, so no future generations may learn of the evils practiced here. History will forget the name Petros Chrysos ever existed. And so his soldiers did their duty. Libraries were burned, statues razed, tomes and records destroyed. When they were done, nothing remained of the infamous Temple of Shadows other than a pile of rubble, and a strange mask within the general's possession. General Alexandre Arc, famed hero of Baal, rode by himself on a single horse-drawn carriage as he made his way back to his home of Ansel. The old farts in Baal's newly established council wanted to send him back with a parade and escort, but he most fervently declined. Times were changing in Remnant. King Osmond had abdicated his throne and the Kingdom of Mantle was being reorganized into the Kingdom of Atlas. Many of the kingdoms were now disbanding their militaries as well to prove their dedication to the newly born peace. The age of war was over, so the good general thought there was no more need to celebrate war heroes like himself. Best to let old soldiers like him just fade away. And so, taking both his severance and the gracious amounts of gifts and medals awarded to him, former General Alexandre Arc gathered all of his possessions in Baal, purchased a cart and steed, and began to make his way towards his ancestral home. With years of warfare now figuratively and literally behind him, Alex's arc traveled on a poorly maintained road located within Vale's southeastern forest, and was now ready for some peace. But they do not deserve peace, do they? A voice spoke out from nowhere but everywhere at once. It was gravely and distorted, and only barely intelligible to Alex. Immediately Alex pulled back on the reins of his cart and drew his sword, scanning the area around him for the speaker. "Who is there?" Alexandre called out. "Show yourself, brigand, and I promise I shall show you quarter." Despite his declaration, no one revealed themselves. Instead, the voice only spoke out once more. "You gave everything to your kingdom, to your king, and this is how they repay you. With a simple horse and carriage. Don't you believe you deserve more?" Alexandre felt the words pierce into his heart. That for all the blood he shed, should not he have been given more? Didn't he deserve more? Angrily, Alex shook the thoughts off. "No. The war is over. I did my duty to my kingdom and that's enough." A chill ran down Alex's spine as the voice spoke once more. "But you can have more. All you have to do is reach out and take it. Put on my mask, and you will be given the power you deserve. Power to do whatever you want. To protect your family, to destroy your enemies. Or to take the crown of king for yourself, and not let Vale cast you aside like an unneeded tool." Alexandre felt his hands move unconsciously towards the bag where he stored the mask he collected from the Temple of Shadows. Meanwhile Nihilus began to put more pressure on the former general. It had been so long. Decades within the possession of those monks, and none of the monks nor any of the sacrifices they brought were worthwhile hosts. None of them were force-sensitive, despite the aura of force that they wore around their bodies. It was as if the planet itself was barren of force-sensitives. Alexandre Arc, however, was a latent force-sensitive. While it wasn't the strongest connection Nihilus had seen, it was more than enough to serve his purposes. The general probably didn't know he was sensitive to the force, as the people of Remnant were ignorant of its very existence. And like most untrained force sensitives, he could not call upon the force to perform the various Jedi and Sith powers. At most, the general's sensitivity would have granted him abnormal luck and intuition. And specifically within the context of these Remnantians, Alexandre Arc's latent sensitivity had resulted in his massive aura, which no doubt contributed to the general's prowess as a warrior. Alexandre Arc was the first person who had the slightest connection to the force Nihilus had seen, meaning he could serve as a host. Thoughts were racing around Alexandre's mind. It would be so easy to listen to the words of the mask, put it on and gain its power. He was already a peerless warrior. If he were to become even more powerful, who could stand against him? Those fools on the council. They were politicians, not warriors. Former King Osmond. The pathetic old man was far beyond his peak. Alexandre felt his fingers run along the edge of the mask. As he did, however, he recalled the wrinkled, decaying face of Petros Chrysos as Alexandre ran Crocea Morse through him. He remembered the corrupt, evil man the monk was. And he refused to become like him. To be a puppet to whatever foul sorcery this mask perfused. "No!" Alexandre roared. "Loyalty is its own reward." Gripping the edge of the mask, Alexandre cried out as he threw the mask away from him. That mask was pure evil. He should have never taken it from the temple. It sought to use him for whatever diabolical plots it had in store. The mask attempted to whisper to him once more, but Alex shut it out through sheer willpower alone. He then swung his sword for the mask, only to find that the mask itself resisted even his strongest blow. Snarling, Alex then went to the back of the cart, retrieving one of his strongboxes and dumping all of the contents out. Gripping the box tightly, he then moved for the mask and threw it inside, ignoring any of its protests as he pressed a few buttons, locking the strongbox shut. Swiftly, Alexandre looked for a place he could hide it. If he couldn't destroy the mask, he would seal it away, hopefully for forever. That's when he saw it. A small, rocky cliffside that would serve his purpose. Approaching the wall, Alexandre activated his semblance geokinesis, stomping his foot in the ground, which sent reverberations through the stone. The rock then shifted, moving itself to Alexandre's will, creating a small cave. The general placed the strongbox within the cavern, and with a final look of disgust and contempt for it, walked away. Exiting the cave, Alexandre stomped once more, sending a wall of stone up from the ground, trapping the mask within. Content that he had sealed away the evil artifact, Alexandre Arc made his way back to his cart. He was going to go home, see his family, and never speak about this moment of weakness that almost sent him down a path of darkness. Meanwhile, the mask of Nihilus felt Alexandre Arc leave its range. The spirit of Nihilus had considered simply consuming Alexandre when he refused to put on the mask, but Nihilus had learned from his previous mistakes. While it was his uncontrollable hunger that forced him to kill potential hosts before he landed on this Force-forsaken planet, killing them had resulted in his prolonged confinement in the mask. With Alexandre Arc leaving alive, he could potentially spread word of the mosque's existence, or at the very least sire more spawn so there would be more Force-sensitive natives on the planet. And so Nihilus would continue the pattern he maintained for the decades and centuries previous. He would continue to sleep and wait until the Force presented him with another opportunity. Seasons continued to pass as Nihilus slept. For the longest time, the only event of worth was a small earthquake that damaged the exterior wall of Nihilus' prison and the storage box that he was stored in. Soon enough, Nihilus once more felt the presence of another latent Force-sensitive being. It was a presence much like that of Alexandre Arc years ago, but one much younger. And one currently fleeing for his life. With a slight pull of the Force, Nihilus drew the boy's attention to his prison. Seeing sanctuary in the small opening to the cave, the boy sprinted for Fisher, forcing himself within. As the boy approached, Nihilus was able to examine him far more closely. It was a young man, probably only a teenager, with unkempt blonde hair and untested armor. But at his side was the blade of Alexandre Arc, Crocea Morse. This, combined with the boy's appearance and connection to the Force, was more than enough evidence for Nihilus to surmise that he was a descendant of the General. And like the General, the boy found the mask of Nihilus a curious artifact. But Nihilus could feel his apprehension and fear, enough that he might abandon the mask right then and there. Repeating what the mask did with Alexandre Arc in the temple, Nihilus gave a small push with the Force, one that was not strong enough to even be considered a mind trick. But it was enough to make the boy's curiosity overtake his fear, causing him to bend down and grab the mask. As soon as the boy touched the mask, there was enough of a connection for Nihilus to make the changes to the boy he needed. Reading the boy's surface thoughts, he gleaned the name John. Nihilus needed a vessel, one strong enough to contain his soul without being destroyed. John's latent sensitivity to the Force was a starting point, but it wasn't enough. The boy was weak and spoiled. First, Nihilus reached out with the Force to unlock the boy's aura, a simple task since aura fed off of the Force like any other power. What Nihilus had planned next, however, was far more difficult and invasive. While the boy's connection to the Force was there, it was latent, dormant. It would take years of training under a master if John wanted to awaken it and actively draw upon the power of the Force. Years that Nihilus no longer wanted to wait. As such, Nihilus called upon the foulest of ancient Sith techniques he had learned from the archives of Marco Ragnos himself. Nihilus reached out with the dark side and gripped onto the midi-chlorians within John, and forced them to multiply. The midi-chlorian count within John skyrocketed, artificially activating and increasing the strength of his connection to the Force. And with that, Nihilus elected to leave the boy alone. Nihilus learned from his mistake with Alexandre Arc, trying to subvert a new host too fast. Instead, Nihilus would monitor the boy, subtly guide him further and further into the dark side, eroding his willpower and pathetic moral fiber. He would feed him crumbs of information, keep him hungry for knowledge of the Force, an irony that was not lost on the Lord of Hunger. With this, John would continue to grow in power, until he would become a vessel truly worthy for Nihilus's return. Chapter 18. Nihilus. Everyone stared in shock at the form of John before them, cloaked in flowing darkness, now adorned with his terrifying mask. All around him, tourists and unarmed students began to flee the scene, while both the soldiers and droids of Atlas, along with several braver student teams like AVRN, stayed. As the heroes all surrounded John's mysterious new form, further away, an amber-eyed, black-haired beauty whispered to her disguised ally. "Neo. Get into position, we're accelerating our plans right now." Neo nodded, and quickly vanished as Cinder pulled out her scroll and began typing. She quickly sent a group text to Adam, Mercury, and Emerald, similarly telling them to move their plans up. Her message sent, Cinder then made herself scarce, joining the groups of fleeing students as she prepared for the next phase of her scheme. Meanwhile, the present members of teams JNPR, RWBY, and Kiro stood surrounding John. Timidly, Ruby stepped forward with a single hand raised as she called out to her friend. "Ya, John. Is that you?" She had no idea what was going on, but she couldn't help but feel an intrinsic terror as she stared at the changed form of her friend. But if John heard her, he showed no outward reaction to her call. Instead, John only extended out his shadowy hand. At first, the shock and terror they had of John was replaced by confusion as John silently stood there with his hand raised for several seconds. A loud crash from behind them stole everyone's attention, causing them to flinch and turn. From the halls of Beacon, an object could be seen hurtling towards them at insane speeds. Several students had to duck out of the way as the object sped past them, and into the hands of John. Those nearby felt their eyes widen a second time, for John was now holding Crocea Morse in his hand. With the student now armed, the Atlas soldiers and drones surrounding him immediately leveled their dust rifles. "Do not make a move," a red-trimmed officer shouted out. "Drop the weapon and slowly raise your hands above your head." However, John seemed to make no move to drop his sword, and instead only extended his empty offhand forward. Not knowing if this was some kind of attack, the Atlesian officer decided not to take any chances. "Open fire," he shouted as both the troopers and drones obeyed, hundreds of dust rounds now flying for the student. "John," Kira called out, not wanting to see what she believed was her friend be gunned down. But as the hundreds of multicolored dust rounds moved to strike their target, everyone was struck by another surprise as they watched every dust bolt freeze in midair before connecting with John. Ruby felt her jaw drop, and it didn't take long for her or for all of her friends to realize what John was doing. John was grabbing every single dust round with his telekinesis, stopping hundreds if not thousands of bullets that were flying at subsonic speeds. To their credit, the Atlas soldiers kept their fingers depressed on their triggers, firing round after round until all of their guns clicked empty. When they saw that John was still standing, untouched by their attacks and surrounded by a literal dome of dust bullets, the officer in charge had the feeling that he may have made a mistake. No one even breathed as they waited to see what John would do next. John's expression was unreadable behind his mask and hood, obscured by the shadows. His body language didn't betray any aggression either. His stance was robotic, almost soulless. It was then that John flicked his wrist. In an instant, faster than almost anyone could react, the frozen dust bolts shot out away from John, flying out in an explosion of ballistics. The soldiers and droids surrounding John were torn apart almost instantaneously, the hundreds of dust rounds shredding their forms. Kiro, JNPR, and RWBY were barely able to hit the deck and avoid the explosion, but many of the remaining students and tourists who stayed to watch what was happening were unable. Screams began to fill the air as dozens of students and bystanders were wounded if not outright killed by the flechettes of dust. As Pyrrha slowly pushed herself off the ground, she felt that her face was wet. Touching it, she pulled back her hand and saw it was covered with blood. Quickly checking herself over, she realized it was not her blood, as she was able to dodge the attack, but instead the exploded viscera of a poor Atlas soldier who was standing in front of her. Same as her, various other students and soldiers began to pull themselves up, Ruby's uncle Kiro being the first to do so. Kira then looked back at John. No. At Nihilus. She knew that this was Nihilus she was looking at, not her leader. Because only Nihilus could look this apathetic to the death and destruction he just wrought. Before Pyrrha could think of her next move however, Nihilus moved again. As Nihilus brought his hands to his chest, Pyrrha's fighter instincts immediately screamed one thing to her: Nihilus was charging up an attack. Move. Pyrrha heard someone yell out. She wasn't sure who, but from the sounds of it was someone older, probably Kiro. Pyrrha didn't take the time to think about what was happening. She stood and began sprinting away. Hesitation in combat meant death, and when someone yelled, "Run!" you ran. It was then that Pyrrha heard the scream. It was more than a vocal scream, though it was sonically loud as well. It was a scream that tore into her very soul, like she was hit by a wave of pure anger and hatred. The scream knocked her off her feet with a wave of force, but also tore into her mind, ripping apart her mental defenses. Pyrrha was stunned for several seconds, until she felt a hand pull her up. Looking as to who it was, she recognized the person as Arslan, leader of Team ABRN. Arslan was shouting something at Pyrrha, but the champion could barely make it out. Arslan then pointed towards Nihilus, and when Pyrrha turned her head, her face fell, as she saw Nihilus standing over even more corpses, students and soldiers having their bodies torn apart by the force scream. At this point, almost everyone who had not planned on fighting was already dead or had hightailed it out of the area. From her peripherals, Pyrrha saw Kiro step forward, wiping blood from his nose with his weapon drawn. "Kids, either call your weapons down or get the hell out." Kiro spoke, his voice hard as he stared Nihilus down. The members of Team RWB, NPR, and ABRN shared glances with one another, before quickly calling down their weapons using their rocket lockers. Strangely enough, Nihilus seemed willing to wait for them to call their weapons and arm themselves. Pyrrha didn't know if that was John inside fighting against Nihilus, or if Nihilus was so confident in his victory that he was willing to give up the advantage. He didn't even move as the students and huntsmen encircled Nihilus, surrounding him. Despite their numbers, Kiro had no doubt that they did not have the advantage. He had hunted enough monstrous grim to know that you never have the advantage against something that can kill you in an instant. He also knew that as the senior huntsman here, he had to take the lead. And so Kiro attacked first, jumping at Nihilus with a leaping slash, hoping his speed could catch him off guard. But Nihilus would not be caught unawares by such a simple strategy. Parrying the blow, Nihilus spun and struck Kiro with a backhanded slap, knocking him back. Kiro stumbled but quickly regained his balance, twirling Harbinger as he mecha shifted it from sword to its war scythe configuration. Kiro then began a series of rapid thrusts at Nihilus, hoping to overwhelm him. But every strike was parried by the Dark Lord with next to little effort. Knocking one of Kiro's attacks to the side, Nihilus cut the distance, almost appearing right in front of the Reaper. Crocea Morse aimed right for his throat. The attack was too fast for even Kiro to dodge, and with the sheer power that Nihilus was using, it would more than easily kill the huntsman. Kiro twisted and pulled back as hard as he could to try and avoid the killing stroke. Just as the strike was about to land, Nihilus took a half step forward to regain the distance Kiro was putting between them. When he did, however, Nihilus stepped on a chunk of viscera that he seemed to have not noticed, causing him to slightly slip. The misstep gave Kiro just enough distance to turn the death blow into a glancing cut that hit his upper arm, unable to break through his aura. Nihilus froze for a brief second as Kiro retreated, confused as to how he didn't foresee the slip with his force senses. Glancing at Kiro, he quickly came to a conclusion. His powers, or semblance, the strange manifestation of the force that allowed each person on Remnant a unique ability, must have somehow interfered. Before he could consider this any more, a voice called out. "Checkmate." He heard Ruby's high-pitched voice yell out as she opened fire with Crescent Rose. As Nihilus deflected the sniper shots, Weiss and Blake both nodded, the Atlesian switching to lighting dust and summoning a time glyph that would increase Blake's speed and agility. Her physical ability now enhanced, Blake charged forward with Gamble's shroud in sword form. At her flanks, the two best melee fighters in the group Pyrrha and Arslan followed. Blake attacked with a flurry of slashes at Nihilus' face, while Pyrrha attacked his unarmed side, and Arslan went for the backs of Nihilus' legs. Against a normal opponent, this would have been far too many attacks for any one person to handle. But Nihilus was far from a normal opponent. Deflecting Blake with his sword, he rapidly riposted, knocking the Faunus back. Simultaneously, his offhand shot out, catching Pyrrha by the throat before she could strike. Through brute strength alone, Nihilus then dragged Pyrrha through the air and slammed her into Arslan behind him, literally beating the Mystralian with John's former partner. Their attack nullified, Nihilus then charged up the force around him, summoning a storm of force drain lightning that slammed into all three huntresses. The young women all screamed as they felt their auras drained from Nihilus' attack. When they began to stumble back, trying to get away from Nihilus, the others opened fire as the Dark Lord was now open. Flexing his control over the Force, Nihilus created a barrier that blocked all of their attacks, before extending his offhand at the retreating students. Nihilus grabbed onto the closest woman, which unluckily for her, was Arslan. Reaching out with the Force, Nihilus gripped onto Arslan by the throat, lifting her into the air while choking the life out of her. Telekinetically bringing her closer. Nihilus brought Crusade Morse down on her, easily shattering her weakened aura and slicing into her flesh. The cut ripped through her chest, leaving a massive gash on her front that began to spew blood. Nihilus ignored the cries of the girl's teammates as he then ingloriously flung her off a beacon's cliff. Ruby's face fell as she watched one of their allies probably die. She may not have considered Arslan a friend, but she was a fellow student and honorable opponent in their first match. Gritting her teeth, Ruby loaded another magazine into Crescent Rose and shouted out, "Ice Flower." Ruby then turned to Ren and Nora, who were similarly shocked at Arslan's apparent demise, and shouted to them, "Ren, Nora, flower power." The Renora duo turned to her in confusion when she barked at them again. "That's a team move of yours, right? Time to use it. We need to slow him down." Ruby's orders seemed to shock them out of their stupor as they moved to attack. As Weiss finished creating the ice glyph around Ruby's sniper, turning all of her shots into ice shots, Ruby opened fire at Nihilus, primarily aiming for his feet to try and freeze them. Meanwhile, Nora began bombarding Nihilus with grenades, hoping to distract while Ren ran towards him, charging his aura in his palms for a paralyzing strike. But even with the cloud of pink smoke that began to envelop the area, Nihilus did not require sight to sense the attacks coming. Rather than deflecting the ice shots with Crusade Morse, which would have frozen his arm, Nihilus caught 2 dust rounds with the Force, and redirected them, flinging them right at Ren and Nora. The 2 students did not expect the sudden reversal, and weren't fast enough to dodge the sniper shots that encased both their torsos in ice. Before Nihilus could follow up, Kiro attacked again, this time supported by the 2 Haven students Nadir and Reese, angrily seeking to avenge their leader. While Kiro engaged in melee, Nadir rode on the back of Reese's hoverboard, taking what potshots at the Dark Lord he could. Deflecting what would have been a headshot, Nihilus then effortlessly flowed into a block as he parried Kiro's sword strike. With a quick extension of his offhand, Nihilus pushed Kiro back with the Force, throwing him off balance. Nihilus stepped forward to strike Kiro down, but for some reason happened to trip on a rock that he didn't seem to notice. Nihilus quickly recovered, but that moment of weakness was enough of an opening for Nadir to hit him in the back with a dust round, and for Kiro to advance and attack as well. Nihilus stumbled forward as the shot hit him in the back, allowing Kiro to perform a sword slash at his head. Before Nihilus could parry it, Kiro's sword then changed form, shifting into its scythe form. Kiro then twisted his weapon and smashed Nihilus' knee with the butt of his scythe. The attack forced Nihilus down as Kiro spun with his momentum, following up with a horizontal slash across Nihilus' torso with his scythe. The attack struck true as Harbinger bit through the Sith Lord's shadowy form, but leaving only a shallow cut that didn't break through John's aura. Nihilus growled in annoyance. Kiro's powers, while not obviously powerful enough to stop Nihilus, was influential enough that it turned the huntsman into more of a problem than he had any right to be. Taking this annoyance and turning it into anger, lightning began to crackle between Nihilus' fingers. Both Kiro's and the students' eyes widened as a storm of lightning burst from Nihilus' hands, flying for all 3 of them. Kiro was fast enough to put Harbinger between him and the lightning, absorbing the attack, but neither Nadir nor Reese were skilled or experienced enough to do something similar. The 2 Haven students took the full brunt of Force lightning, screaming as the dark side coursed through them, blasting them off the hoverboard and onto the ground in a smoking heap. Nihilus stepped to finish off the students, when he noticed his feet were being encased in ice. Glancing down, he saw one of Weiss's trademark glyphs beneath him. He looked back up and saw the heiress, rapier stabbed in the ground, breathing heavily as she forgoed buffing her team and went to attacking him directly. Nihilus then felt danger coming from behind, sensing RWBY going in for a desperate melee attack with Crescent Rose. Without even sparing her a glance, Nihilus reached out with the force and grabbed onto RWBY mid-leap. RWBY froze in mid-air, confused as to what was happening, before Nihilus then slammed her into the ground. Simultaneously, Nihilus threw Crocea Morse right for Weiss, his sword becoming a flying buzzsaw aiming to tear her in half. Weiss's eyes widened as she pulled Myrtanaster out of the ground, ending her ice effect on Nihilus, and used her rapier to deflect Crocea Morse. However, the sheer physical force and momentum of the attack alone was enough to knock the light heiress backwards and off her feet. Meanwhile, RWBY slowly tried to pick herself up as blood poured out of her nose. The stinging pain and amount of blood flowing told her it was broken. As she struggled, however, a boot hit her face as Nihilus kicked her back. Dazed, RWBY was helpless as Nihilus moved to finish her, until a scream took his attention. Bolin, the last member standing of Team ABRN, charged at Nihilus, swinging his bow staff in a wild rage. It was a pathetic attack that even pre-Dark Side John could have deflected. Nihilus parried the attack and easily riposted, forcing Bolin back. Nihilus then glanced at RWBY, who could still only watch what was happening in disoriented terror as Nihilus then used the force to yank Crescent Rose out of her hands. The weakened RWBY tried to hold onto her weapon, but was unable to. She could only watch in dismay as Nihilus levitated Crescent Rose in front of himself, and as he clenched a fist, crushed the sniper side into a bowling ball-sized heap of red and black scrap metal. Before she could even process what just happened, Nihilus then flung the improvised cannonball right for Bolin. RWBY's head twisted to follow her former weapon, and to her horror, she watched as Crescent Rose went through Bolin's head, instantly killing the boy. Bolin's entire head was gone, completely erased by the hunk of metal that flew through him, only to be replaced by a fountain of blood that shot out from his torso, coating everyone nearby. It was at that moment RWBY felt the fear take over her, any hope she stubbornly clung onto evaporating. One of her best friends just destroyed her weapon, and used it to kill another student. Now here she was, weaponless in a battle against a complete monster. Before RWBY could drop completely into despair, however, the sounds of reinforcements came with a literal trumpet's blare. RWBY watched as Nihilus was buffeted back by visible sound waves as Flint Cole of Team FNKI arrived along with his team, the entirety of Team BRNZ, and an adult huntress that RWBY had never seen before. As the reinforcements arrived, they surrounded Nihilus while also aiding the beleaguered students currently in the fight, helping Weiss, Nora, and Ren help. Meanwhile, the other fighters who had taken some damage but were not out, namely Kiro, Pyrrha, and Blake, joined them in encircling Nihilus once more. Despite being surrounded by even more warriors, Nihilus seemed almost nonchalant about the situation, his spectre-like body showing no obvious signs of distress. In fact, to everyone's surprise, Nihilus seemed to turn away from them and look up to the sky above Vale. Nihilus then extended his hand away from any students, and to the airspace he was gazing at. Knowing of his telekinesis, Kiro immediately looked for whatever Nihilus was grabbing onto. And to Kiro's horror, there was only one thing in view that Nihilus could be pulling. Above Vale's skyline, General Ironwood's flagship airship began to list, straining as it descended out of the sky. Kiro could tell that the ship was trying to fight against the sudden pull, engines blasting at full charge to try and break out of whatever was forcing it to move against its will, the metal hull of the ship straining under the pressure. Soon enough, the airship's starboard entire engine burst into flames as it overloaded itself trying to break loose. The airship was now falling out of the sky, on a path right for Beacon. Several other students also looked up to the sky in shock and awe. Kiro couldn't help but almost laugh at the absurdity of the situation. That son of a bitch was throwing an airship at them. Soon enough, experience and training replaced stupefying astonishment as Kiro yelled out to everyone once more, "Scatter!" Immediately everyone began turning and sprinting, all saw what was coming and wanted to be as far away from ground zero as possible. Kiro didn't even have time to look after his niece as he moved as fast as he could. As he dashed forward, a cry of pain caught the Kiro's attention. To his right, Kiro saw a civilian, one of the waitresses from the fairgrounds, having hidden since the start of the battle, fall to the ground after slipping on a bit of viscera. Kiro's eyes widened. While he'd never know for sure, he couldn't help but feel that his semblance had a hand in causing her to fall. Not for the first time in his life, did Kiro curse not having any control over his semblance. He could just leave her and keep moving, but Kiro knew he couldn't live with himself if he left her to die when it was his fault she was in that situation in the first place. It would be the same as killing her himself. And so, Kiro pivoted and moved for her. He could get her out. At least that's what he told himself. When he got to her, Kiro grabbed the waitress's hand and moved to run. Unfortunately, the very moment he reached her, the Atlesian airship collided with Beacon's courtyard. The resulting dust explosion enveloped the entire area in a shockwave of smoke and heat. Kiro, knowing running was no longer an option, instead dove down and wrapped his arms around the waitress, hoping his aura could take the blow for the both of them. Just as he did, the impact of the explosion hit him, and then all he saw was blackness. Kira groaned as she awakened. Everything hurt, and for the second time today her ears rang with a high-pitched buzz. Lamenting the loss of that frequency range, Kira pushed herself up as she surveyed the situation around her. The sky was now dark, and the last thing Kira remembered was the orange sky of evening. That meant she was unconscious for at least a few minutes, hopefully no more than that. Looking around, all she saw was devastation. Chunks of Beacon were smashed apart by the explosion. Meanwhile trees, grass, and various stalls were all burning, providing some light for her. To her side, Kira heard a high-pitched groan of pain. Turning, she saw the form of Ruby beside her, similarly worse for wear. Bending over, Kira gently awoke the Reaper. "Ruby," she said as she shook her awake. "Ruby, get up, we have to move." Slowly, Ruby's eyes blinked open, obviously confused and disoriented. "Kira," she moaned, accepting the taller redhead's hand as she pulled her up. "Yes, Ruby. We have to find the off." Kira's planning was cut off by a terrifying roar behind her. Immediately both she and Ruby turned, and to their horror, a massive Ursa was making its way through the destroyed fairgrounds. Not only that, they saw packs of Beowulfs prowl the territory, while White Fang grunts also patrolled the school grounds, gunning down anyone they saw. Kira and Ruby both crouched low, hoping to avoid detection. Apparently, a lot more than they thought had happened while they were unconscious. Scanning the destroyed school grounds, Kira also looked for any sign of Nihilus, and luckily he appeared nowhere in sight. Another crack of a dust rifle followed by the scream of a civilian caused the two huntresses in training to hide even further. "Kira, what do we do?" Ruby asked, fear and uncertainty gripping her voice. Kira's gut reaction was to say it was going to be okay, and then come up with a plan. But when she couldn't come up with anything, she just shook her head and said, "I don't know, Ruby. I don't know." Chapter 19. Chaos. 30 minutes ago. Standing atop the roof of one of the academic buildings overlooking Beacon's docks, Cinderfall watched the battle between John Arc and the soldiers of Atlas with rapt attention, her eyes never leaving the shadowy form of what used to be John. Meanwhile her allies Emerald, Mercury, and Neo watched the scene in silent horror. They knew John Arc was a threat, but they didn't know how to even start processing what they were looking at. "Mercury," Cinder began, drawing the silver-haired boy's eyes away from the fight. "Are you ready to help spread my message?" Mercury gaped at Cinder, having been so distracted by the fight he didn't even have his scroll out. When he saw Cinder's eyes narrow at his lack of response, he immediately fumbled out his scroll and aimed it at the battle. Yeah, totally boss." Cinder then grew a sadistic smile as she said, "Good. Then begin the broadcast." At her words, Mercury pressed a button on his scroll and began to live stream directly to the CCT. With their control over the tower, it was simple for them to hijack the broadcast and change it from whatever tournament fight was going on, to the battle in front of them for everyone across Remnant to see. Cinder smirked as she was about to go off script, but she was confident that her improvisation was going to inspire just as much fear as the execution of the Atlas android. "People of Remnant, you have been lied to." Cinder began her voiceover. "Beacon Academy. Atlas Academy. All of the huntsmen and huntresses continue to lie, all to cover up a single truth as to not cause a panic. Mercury continued to film John as Cinder spoke, making sure to capture the moment he flung the student Arslan off of Beacon's cliff. After pausing for dramatic effect as the student's death was shown to everyone on live television, Cinder continued. The Grimm are not some faraway problem that only the poorest of villages deal with. They are not some rabble of mindless beasts, but an army, led by an intelligent force. At her words, Mercury zoomed in on John's shadow form, this time throwing his sword at Weiss while slamming RWBY into the ground with his telekinesis. In truth, Cinder had no idea what John was. She didn't believe he was one of her mistress's followers, as there was no way Salem would have kept a power like him hidden away from her. Absolutely no way. But at the very least, John would prove an effective patsy and fall guy for her, taking all the attention while allowing her and Salem to move undetected. Those in charge would hide the truth from you. The truth about how close the apocalypse truly is. Neither Atlas and General Ironwood, nor Vale and Professor Ozpin are truly prepared to protect their people. As Cinder spoke, she watched as John removed some student's head using the remains of RWBY's weapon. After a pause to let what just happened sink in, she continued. They have been so focused on defeating each other, preparing for war between Atlas and Vale, that they didn't even realize one of their own students was a monster. Cinder then nodded to Emerald, who quickly used her own scroll and began typing. Luckily for Cinder, she had the foresight to know something was happening when John began his breakdown, and had the mid-haired thief record the whole altercation. With a press of a button, Emerald broadcasted the recording, showing the whole world John Arc putting on the strange mask of his, then transforming into his pseudo-grim form. Once the video was finished, Cinder let the video cut to a red screen with a black queen chess piece in the center. These so-called leaders, or selfish, foolish men who have led their people to ruin. And now, because of their failure, all any of us can do is pray that we will come out of the following storm alive. As Cinder finished her speech, she nodded, and Mercury cut the transmission, broadcasting only static. Cinder smiled. She could feel the fear in the air. The terror. Grimm from all over were now converging on Vale as she spread her message. Not only that, but Adam and his pack of animals were on the way to Beacon as well, along with some of the Grimm they had captured. Now, Beacon would fall, and with it, she would gain control of the power that was rightfully hers. Cinder. Mercury stammered out, drawing the half-maiden from her fantasy. What? She snapped back as she glared at the crippled assassin. To her annoyance, Mercury didn't respond immediately, only pointing to the sky. Following his finger, she felt her jaw drop and eyes widen as she watched John pull an Atlesian airship out of the sky and throw it at Beacon. Isn't that the airship that Roman is on? Mercury said as he was finally able to find his voice. At his words, Neo looked up and in mute horror, came to the same realization. Once Cinder regained her wits after seeing the sheer absurdity of the action, she turned to the others, yelling, "We are leaving, now." This command snapped them out of their own dazes and they immediately turned around and moved. Luckily for the team of teenage villains, they were far enough away and fast enough that they were able to escape the massive explosion of dust behind them. Once the apex of the explosion finished, they turned and paused to look at destruction that was wrought, Cinder almost looking on in admiration, while Neo looked on in despair. "Come." Cinder then spoke, drawing eyes to her. "We're pulling back to Amity Arena. The civilians will be clearing out of there, and the huntsmen and soldiers will be leaving to deal with invasion. We will let them fight it out and exhaust themselves, before moving in for our final objective." Cinder turned around and began leaping between rooftops as she scanned for a bullhead they could hijack. Quickly, Emerald followed, with Mercury sparing a tentative glance at Neo before moving on as well. Neo, tears falling down her face as she looked at the burning wreckage of the airship, eventually turned to follow, as she now had nowhere else to go. Darth Nihilus stood over the destroyed ruins of Beacon's air docks. Fires spread out across the trees and merchant stalls that once spread out across the fairgrounds. The Remnantians he was fighting, the huntsmen and huntresses his host knew, were now spread out across the devastation, either having escaped the explosion or were dead and unconscious amongst the rubble. As the Dark Lord stepped forward to continue his hunt, something drew his attention. Looking up, he saw the circling forms of Nevermores, the crow-like Grimm swooping down and landing beside him. The Grimm looked at him, heads tilting in confusion as they tried to ascertain what Nihilus was. Meanwhile, Nihilus looked at the Grimm with curiosity in turn. While he had been on Remnant for some time, he had very few opportunities to actually look at a Grimm in person. He felt them when he was but a soul trapped within his mask, but to now look up on them with his own eyes, they truly were beautiful. These Grimm were pure dark side. Unlike Sith spawn like the Tarantatix or Tukata, these were not animals mutated by the dark side, but physical manifestations of the dark side of the Force itself in the form of monstrous animals. Nihilus could only imagine how envious Sith alchemists like Naga Sato and Exar Kun would have been towards the Grimm's creator. An infinite army of darkness was the dream of any Dark Lord. Regardless, as these creatures were made of the Force itself, that meant two things for Nihilus. 1. He could feed upon them, much like his host had discovered weeks prior during the breach. And 2. He could twist them to serve him. Reaching out with the dark side, Nihilus tore his way into the bestial minds of the avian Grimm. Much in the same way one would use the Force to beast trick an animal, Nihilus used the dark side to dominate the mind of the Grimm, forcing it into servitude. The Nevermore struggled and spasmed as Nihilus gained control over them, until their minds were completely and wholly dedicated to him. Satisfied with his work, he let the Grimm go, allowing them to return to the air and begin hunting for survivors. Before Nihilus could move on, the sound of jet engines then drew his attention. Turning, he watched as several bullhead dropships flew above Beacon, seemingly avoiding the ruined air docks and Nihilus himself. Nihilus considered ripping the airships out of the sky, but he felt something within. Darkness, anger, and hate oozed from the occupants, and it wasn't directed towards him. Nihilus watched as the bullheads hovered over the far side of the campus, and opened their doors. From within, he saw a ground-based Grimm such as Ursa and Beowulf's being dropped, unleashed upon the unsuspecting students, as well as members of the terrorist organization the White Fang. Now that was curious. Someone was using his return to enact their own attack against Beacon. Nihilus would say it was an interesting coincidence, but he knew there was no such thing. Regardless, the machinations of others was not something he was concerned with. Reaching out, he searched if there were any other founts of the Force he could drain. While he could drain the Grimm, his ability to control them made them more useful to him alive. And as he reached out, Nihilus felt three sources which he could feed upon. The first was at the top of Beacon Tower, and the second far below it. The third was currently moving towards Amity Arena with great haste. This third source was the strongest Force signature he could feel, and therefore his first target. And so, with a Force-empowered leap, Nihilus began hunting. Present time. RWBY and Pyrrha crouched low behind the rubble as they stalked their prey. Two White Fang grunts currently standing in front of the closest entrance into Beacon Academy. One was currently casually looting some dead students of their lean and other valuables while the other kept watch. Almost growling, RWBY could only look at the terrorist with anger at his actions. These people were her friends, her classmates, many of them were Faunus, and he was fucking looting them. The Huntress felt her grip tighten around her weapon. With Crescent Rose destroyed, RWBY was forced to resort to taking a dust rifle from a deceased Atlas soldier, along with whatever ammunition he had on him. While even she could see the slight hypocrisy in judging the White Fang soldier for doing something similar, at least she did it for survival rather than greed. RWBY. Pyrrha whispered beside the younger team leader. How do you want to do this? RWBY quickly glanced at her older friend, before coming to a decision. We'll take them out, but we have to do it fast and quiet. We can't give away our position. Pointing at the grunt who was looting, she said. My semblance can get me close enough to him that I can probably knock him out before he calls for help. Can you get the other one? Glancing at the grunt on watch, Pyrrha nodded. Yes, I can take him out with my javelin. As she said this, she shifted Milo into its spear form. Okay, on 3. RWBY grit out as she clutched her rifle. 1, 2, 3. At her count RWBY burst into a cloud of flower petals and made right for the White Fang grunts. The terrorist on guard saw her approach, pointed, and was about to shout, when Milo slammed into his chest, spearing him away. The looting grunt turned at the noise, confused as to what was happening, when RWBY reappeared in front of him, dust rifle raised. With an angry cry, RWBY brought the butt of the rifle down on the grunt's face, instantly knocking him to the ground. The grunt groaned, and RWBY instantly smashed him in the face again, knocking him out. Standing over the unconscious body, RWBY called over Pyrrha, who recalled her weapon as she quickly caught up. Before they had a chance to speak, the sound of a nevermore squawking above them caught their attention. Looking up, RWBY quickly turned to Pyrrha. "Hurry, let's go inside." Without hesitation, the two huntresses rushed indoors and hopefully out of sight of any Grimm. Now in relative safety, Pyrrha and RWBY took the chance to catch their breaths. RWBY was finally able to take the time to really take stock of what her rifle could do and how much ammo she had, while Pyrrha moved to dig out her scroll. Dialing Nora first, Pyrrha listened to the call ring several times before the line went dead. Sighing, she then pressed the holographic buttons and called Ren instead. After a few rings, Pyrrha gasped as Ren answered the call. "Ren," Pyrrha practically shouted, drawing RWBY's attention too. "Pyrrha." "RWBY," Ren whispered, but obviously happy to see them. "Is it just you two?" he asked, moving his scroll as he tried to see behind them. Pyrrha nodded her head. "Yes. We woke up near each other. Where are you? Where's Nora?" "When we fled, the explosion knocked us far back, around the Great War Memorial." Ren then sighed as he turned his camera, and "Nora's right here." Moving his camera, they saw the unconscious form the Nora Valkyrie, heavily burned and obviously worse for wear. "When the airship hit, Nora tried to cover me with her body, shield me from the blast," Ren said through grit teeth, obviously angry at the whole situation. Pyrrha gasped at the state her friend was in, before collecting herself to reassure Ren. "Don't worry Ren, we'll get her out of this." Ren returned a tired smile, when RWBY moved in front of the scroll. "What about Blake and Weiss? Have you seen them?" Ren shook his head. "No sorry. A lot was going on back at the docks." Biting her lip, RWBY took a calming breath before responding. "It's fine, at least we know where you two are. But we need a plan." Pyrrha and Ren nodded in agreement, both looking to RWBY to take the lead. RWBY was slightly surprised by this, but quickly realized it made sense that she was in command, being the only team leader there. Steeling herself, she quickly came up with a shell of a strategy. "We need to fall back, head to a rally point where we can meet up with the others," she began. "Any ideas where the others might head to?" Thinking on this, Ren then added in his 2 cents. "Beacon Tower. With the air docks destroyed, any other survivors would be heading out to Beacon Tower." Pyrrha nodded her head at his assessment. "It is both the largest and most defensible structure in the school. If there's anywhere survivors are meeting up, it's there." "Good thinking," RWBY agreed. "Okay, we'll make our way to Beacon Tower. Do you think you can get there with Nora, Ren?" "Yes. My semblance should be enough to hide the two of us from the Grimm, and the White Fang aren't exactly being subtle with their actions, so I can easily avoid them." "Alright. Good luck Ren, we'll see you there," RWBY said. With a silent nod, Ren hung up. "Do you want to give Weiss and Blake a call?" Pyrrha asked as she turned to the younger huntress. RWBY then dug into her pocket, and disappointedly found her scroll broken. "Just my luck," she muttered. "Here, let me." Pyrrha's offer was cut off as the two huntresses heard a growl. Immediately spinning, they saw that a few Beowulfs had found them, most likely attracted by the noise of the previous call. Later, RWBY hissed out as she raised her rifle. "We can try calling them once we get to the tower." Nodding her head, Pyrrha stood and took her own combat stance. They then charged forward, not planning on letting any Grimm stand between them and their friends. RWBY and Pyrrha cut their way through Grimm after Grimm as they made their way for Beacon's tower. There were far too many Grimm in the area than what the White Fang could have possibly dropped off on their own. RWBY was reasonably sure that John's attack was stirring up a massive amount of fear and other negative emotions within Beacon and Vale, drawing in more Grimm from the surrounding areas. With a pull of the trigger, RWBY popped the head of another Beowulf. The two had long abandoned stealth and were making a mad dash for Beacon Tower. Bursting through a double door, the two huntresses exited out of the building they were sheltering in and found themselves in the middle of Beacon's inner courtyard. Unfortunately for them, there was a horde of lesser Grimm between them and the tower. Swiftly, Pyrrha and Ruby took their combat stances as various creeps and Beowulfs turned to face them. Before they had a chance to attack, however, the gathering in front of them was shredded by a hail of bullets, as fire dust rounds shredded through them. Ruby and Pyrrha had to actually dodge to the side, hiding behind a pillar to avoid being hit. It seemed that whomever was shooting didn't notice them and was focused on solely killing Grimm. Once the horde was thoroughly dealt with, Ruby decided to stick her arm out from behind the pillar and yell, "Friendly! Friendly!" As she did so, the unmistakable voice of Glinda Goodwitch cut through the air. "Miss Autumn, cease fire." Almost immediately the gunfire slowed to a halt, allowing Ruby and Pyrrha to exit their cover. With the Grimm now gone, and the threat of friendly fire mitigated, they could actually assess their surroundings. At the base of Beacon Tower, defending the doors, she saw several teams of students, most recognizably teams SSSN, CFVY, and CRDL, along with both Professor Goodwitch and Ozpin. Behind the front line, they could see Ren and the unconscious Nora as well, apparently having reached the tower before them. All of the students looked tired, sporting various minor injuries, but were still able to fight. "Ruby! Pyrrha! Hurry, over here!" Sun called out, waving them over. The two teens complied and quickly crossed the no man's land in front of the tower. Once they reached a point of relative safety, they were quickly met by their friends and professors. "Girls, are you all right?" Glinda quickly asked while visually checking them over. "We're fine, Professor." Ruby tried to wave off her concern. "Low aura, and I lost my weapon. But we're still alive." "That's very good." Ozpin nodded. "Now, are either of you able to tell me what is going on? We've lost communication with the outside, and the White Fang and Grimm have been assaulting the tower non-stop." Ruby and Pyrrha looked at each other, only now realizing they finally had time to rationalize what they just went through. Pyrrha moved to say something, but found that words had failed her, resulting in nothing coming out of her mouth. However, Ruby was able to answer their headmaster's question. It was John. He put on some kind of Grimm mask, and it turned him into a monster, some kind of humanoid Grimm. Ruby almost started yelling. "Gods, he was killing so many. He's become Nihilus now." Pyrrha quietly added on, causing her fellow teens to look at her in confusion while Ozpin grimaced, and Glinda's face fell in horror. "I don't know if there's anything left of John in him." Meanwhile, whoever orchestrated that message across the CCT is also most likely the one coordinating the White Fang. Ozpin shook his head, morose at how long everything had fallen apart so quickly, before turning to Glinda. "Glinda, take command of the defenses here." He then looked at Pyrrha and said, "I'm sorry this has to happen like this, Miss Nikos, but I need an answer now." Pyrrha's own face fell at what Ozpin was asking of her. Too much was happening too fast, and she didn't know if she could handle taking on the burden of being a maiden on top of everything. She looked to Ruby at her side, who stared at her in confusion and worry, then to Ren, who had a countenance of the same. She looked at Glinda, who even behind her stern expression, Pyrrha could see sadness and pity. Then she looked at the devastation around her. Her school was all but destroyed. Dozens, if not hundreds of her fellow students and civilians killed. This was chaos in its purest form. And if she had the capability to put this right, to get the power to protect and save everyone she could, didn't she have the responsibility to do so? Steeling herself, Pyrrha looked back up, meeting the headmaster's gaze as she said, "All to it."